I would say that it's not going to do much to headline voting intention polls. I don't think it will do anything for Starmer's popularity, which, even though he's more popular than Sunak, they're both very unpopular.
Yeah.
And I think that plays into a wider question about sort of deficit of trust in our politicians.
Wherever you are, if Labour come in after the election, they're going to be inheriting a really grim, tough economic picture. And one of the things they'll be inheriting, we can bet our bottom dollar on, is going to be economic numbers that have been coloured by tax cuts in the coming budget, because that's going to happen. And Labour are now committed. I don't know how hard they're committed, but they are committed not to reverse the tax cuts that we're expecting. That's right, isn't it, Stefan?
It is. They've said very clearly they won't increase personal taxation in an election. So
they said that after the autumn statement, and that goes for the coming budget too.
It does, and I can't see any way that they would not choose to go with that line, because otherwise they'd be going into an election increasing taxes, and that would be a massive gift for the Conservatives, and especially considering Rachel Reeves and Starmer have clearly put above all else fiscal discipline, the idea that they're going to need competent managers, and should try not to scare any wavering potential new voters for them. So there's no way they'd reverse the cuts, which means obviously that they will have to then deal with the massive spending cuts if they come, when they come, that will be baked into their own first budget. So it really gives them such little room for manoeuvre, considering that they are also committed to reducing debt by the end of the next parliament.
I mean, you really, really would bet on them being bound by that straitjacket. I mean, you never know till you do know. I mean, when we go back to the 79 election, I mean, it took a couple of budgets in before the Conservative Party, which came in as a tax-cutting government, whacked up the burden of taxation to unheard of levels, because the books showed that it was really tough and they felt they had to take that action. Well, Labour's going to be inheriting very, very tough books too. I'm not saying they're going to go the same way as Geoffrey Howe back then, but I say you never know till you do know. Scarlett and Stefan, what did you make of what we saw today? Because that letter between David Lammy and David Cameron, it did mean that Labour was swinging behind those calls for an immediate ceasefire. What do you make of it? Have Labour been, I don't know, following rather than taking any kind of lead on this?
I mean, I would say they've been following. It's interesting because I think if you look at public opinion, even in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, there was actually always more support for a ceasefire than there was for anything else. Public are pretty split on this issue. It is worth saying that support for a ceasefire has only increased, as has sympathies for Palestinians, actually. There are big age divides. Younger voters feel much more pro-Palestinian than older voters, for example. Labour voters feel very strongly about it, which partly explains the problems that Keir Starmer is now having internally in his party. But yeah, I would say it does certainly feel like they're being led rather than followed.
Yeah, what do you say, Stefan?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think a big, sort of precursor to this were Joe Biden's words last week when he came out and said that Israel were going too far in the bombing of Gaza, and basically showed a clear change of position, and we've seen similar from Jake Sullivan since then. So I think that the question of is Labour leading or following? They clearly are following, and I think that any British government, to a certain extent, will have to follow the lead of the United States in this issue.
Yeah.
But I think that to be honest, I think Starmer and Lammy were very happy to take this route because they're under so much pressure internally. And, remember, there is a vote again next week for a ceasefire being brought forward by the SNP. So anything they can do to try to, not get the backlash that they've been receiving from voters in certain constituencies, they will definitely take that opportunity.
Well, you've got to say, being so inhibited by the sensitivities in your own party and in your own ranks and among your own supporters is not a great look if you're the opposition at a stage like this, and you appear to be getting within touching distance of power. It's been the abiding impression of Labour's handling of this has been caution under pressure from internal influences.
Yes, and I have to say that's not just the handling of this, but it plays into people's anxieties about them generally speaking, which is that they are weak, they don't necessarily know what they stand for, and that they can't make up their mind, they change too easily. And so actually we've had a few different things recently that have played into that idea, and I think that's damaging. Of course, it's not so damaging that they're taking anything like a pounding, let alone a serious pounding in the polls. They're still 20 points ahead, but it's not...
So tell me, Scarlett, I mean, we had that poll just a couple of days ago, Savanta, which recorded what looked like a drop of 7 points in Labour's lead over the Conservatives. And the big question then was, is it an outlier? Will there be other polls that show that the trend is still going on as before? Is there any evidence of what the answer to that is at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually the fieldwork for that poll was the 9th to 11th of February, I believe. So it was actually slightly too soon, really. And generally, polls don't work. You can do a snap poll that you turn around very fast to try and take the mood music. This is not one of those polls. It's a weekly voting intention, or fortnightly, I think. And actually, it's interesting interesting because Savanta's data fluctuates lots. So this one showed quite a substantial drop, relatively speaking. The last one saw a rise. So actually, over time, it balances out. There have been signs that if you sort of aggregate all the polls that we've been getting over the last week, Labour have shown a slight dip, but nothing substantial. So I think overall, it's probably too soon to say.
Too soon to say, right? I mean, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. Do you want to stick your neck out a tiny bit and say how you reckon it's going to shake up with another couple of polls?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't actually think it will damage voting intention that much. I think we've seen that polling lead has been remarkably resilient over the last year, kind of no matter what the Conservatives or Labour do. Nothing seems to change very much. We know that more and more voters are going to reform, but that's all its own story. So I would say that it's not going to do much to headline voting intention polls. I don't think it will do anything for Starmer's popularity, which, even though he's more popular than Sunak, they're both very unpopular.
Yeah.
And I think that plays into a wider question about sort of deficit of trust in our politicians.
Made this point yesterday. I mean, neither of these two main party leaders impressed the public a huge amount, and we're heading for what looks like a presidential campaign. That's going to be fun, isn't it?
Yeah, especially for long-suffering journalists. But I think one point to make is that we've seen in England, in the UK, and also other countries similar to the UK with similar electoral systems like Australia, even though it is slightly different and a bit more geared towards something towards PR. There has been a trend that long-term incumbent governments, even if they're up against opposition leaders who aren't that popular, they can sometimes still win just because there is so much fatigue with the central party. And I'll make the example that many Labour people in Britain look to is the Australian Labour Party. They look to Anthony Albanese, the current Prime Minister, who was never popular. He was quite unpopular. But because the sort of level of frustration with the incumbent Conservative government was there, they overlooked that and just were willing to give the other guys a shot. And I think that oftentimes, that is the leading factor for people when they vote, is just the feeling that it's time for a change. And I think, Scarlett, I'd like to hear your opinion. I think a lot of people feel that now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people overwhelmingly feel it's time for a change. They're not quite sure what they want instead, but they think they want finished with, the last 14 years. I think the only thing I'd say to that was actually, I think, adds to your point rather than detracts from it, is that you can win as an unpopular leader even if you're the incumbent party. So actually, I know it was kind of more like an insurgent campaign, but we saw Boris Johnson do that in 2019. Obviously, he had a sort of charisma and power to win new voters over to the party, but overall, it was unpopular with the country. It just so happened that Jeremy Corbyn was quite a lot more unpopular, and that I think is what sort of quite similar to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, interesting.